The Hedingham neighborhood in Raleigh, North Carolina, presents itself as the archetypal image of American suburban stability. Developed around a manicured golf course, the community is a sprawling network of cul-de-sacs, two-story homes with vinyl siding, and driveways filled with family SUVs. It is the kind of place designed to be insulated from the chaotic pulse of the outside world, a sanctuary where the most pressing local controversies typically involve homeowners association disputes or traffic patterns near the Neuse River. In October 2022, the rhythm of life in Hedingham was dictated by school schedules and the cooling autumn air. There was no visible decay, no pervasive sense of danger, and certainly no external indication that one of the state's most horrific acts of violence was being meticulously engineered behind the closed door of a teenager's bedroom on Sahalee Way. At the center of this narrative of assumed normalcy was the Thompson family. To the outside observer, they were indistinguishable from their neighbors. Alan and Elise Thompson were raising two teenage sons, one 6-year-old James and one 5-year-old Austin. The age gap between the brothers was small enough that they moved through the world in tandem, often seen together, sharing the same general peer group and the same domestic orbit. James was a junior at Knightdale High School, described by those who knew him as vibrant and engaging. Austin, a sophomore, was quieter, a detail that in hindsight is often reinterpreted as brooding, but at the time was simply read as the reserve of an introverted adolescent. The facade of normalcy in the Thompson household was maintained by the universal opacity of the teenage experience. Parents in the digital age are accustomed to a certain degree of withdrawal from their children, a retreat into screens and headphones that is widely accepted as a developmental phase rather than a warning sign. Austin Thompson exploited this assumption of privacy. He did not present the jagged edges of a behavioral problem child. He was not known to law enforcement. There were no police visits to the home for domestic disturbances, no suspensions for violent outbursts at school that made the local news, and no terrified peers reporting specific threats to the administration. He existed in the beige middle ground of suburban life, neither a star nor an outcast, effectively invisible in his averageness. This invisibility was his primary camouflage. While the community saw a quiet high school student, Austin Thompson was internally cultivating a profound and violent misanthropy. The duality of his existence is what would later prompt the judicial system to grapple with the concept of irreparable corruption. He attended classes, ate dinner with his family, and likely interacted with the very neighbors he would later target, all while harboring a worldview that categorized human beings not as individuals, but as a plague. The distinct lack of external friction in his life suggests a terrifying capacity for compartmentalization. He did not leak his intentions through the typical channels of modern disaffection. There were no frantic manifestos posted to public message boards or live-stream declarations of intent in the days leading up to the event. His hatred was analog, private, and contained within the walls of his own mind and the pages of a handwritten notebook. In that notebook, Thompson documented a philosophy that was strikingly callous for a 15-year-old. He wrote of his hatred for humans, justifying his eventual actions with a warped eco-fascist logic that claimed humanity was destroying the planet. This motive, discovered only after the devastation, stands in stark contrast to the setting. Hedingham is not an industrial wasteland or a place of desperate poverty. It is a green, leafy enclave. Yet, in the midst of this comfort, Thompson nurtured a nihilistic belief system that demanded bloodshed. The dissonance between his environment's safe, supported upper middle class and his internal monologue is absolute. It challenges the comforting sociological search for a clear root cause, such as trauma, abuse, or poverty. By all available metrics, Austin Thompson had the resources to thrive, yet he chose to plan a massacre. The planning itself was an integral part of the facade. An impulsive act of violence is often preceded by visible agitation, a snapping of the nerves that those around the perpetrator can witness. Thompson's violence was not impulsive, it was predatory. He understood the mechanics of the household and the vulnerability of his victims. He knew where the weapons were stored and how to access them. He understood the layout of the neighborhood and the walking trails along the Neuse River Greenway, paths used by joggers and dog walkers who felt entirely secure in their surroundings. He mapped out a path of destruction while living amidst the people he intended to kill. This requires a sustained performance of normalcy that goes beyond simple secrecy. It requires looking a family member in the eye and concealing the fact that you intend to end their life. The relationship between Austin and his brother James is the most chilling element of this facade. They lived under the same roof, presumably shared meals, and navigated the complexities of adolescence side by side. James, by all accounts, was a typical teenager with a life full of potential. There is no public record of a blood feud between the brothers, no history of violent rivalry that would presage a fratricide. To the parents and the community, they were just brothers. The betrayal of that bond requires a suspension of empathy that is difficult to comprehend. For Austin to plan a mass shooting that began with the execution of his own brother implies that the facade was not just for the outside world, but for his immediate family as well. He allowed James to believe he was safe in his presence, right up until the moment he wasn't. As October 13 approached, the camouflage remained perfect. The Thompson home on Sahali Way gave off no distress signals. The neighbors, many of whom would soon be victims or witnesses, went about their daily routines. An off-duty police officer, Gabriel Torres, prepared to head to work, unaware that his proximity to the Thompson residence would place him in the crosshairs. The illusion of safety in Hedingham was absolute because the threat was not an intruder breaking in from the outside, but a child growing up within. The horror of the Thompson case lies in this domestic integration. The danger sat at the breakfast table. It did homework in the living room. It walked the quiet streets of the golf course community, indistinguishable from any other youth in a hoodie. The silence of Austin Thompson was not peace. It was preparation. The irreparable corruption, cited years later by Judge Ridgway, was not a sudden onset condition, but a slow-growing rot hidden beneath a veneer of suburban banality. The parents, Alan and Elise, were left with the impossible task of reconciling the son they thought they knew with the calculated killer he became. They, too, were victims of the facade, living with a stranger who wore their son's face. The tragedy is that the warning signs, if they existed, were so subtle or so deeply buried in the psyche of a quiet teen that they were rendered invisible against the backdrop of ordinary life. On that Thursday afternoon, the weather was mild, the neighborhood was quiet, and the Thompson house was still. The facade held until the very last second. There was no shouting match, no crashing of furniture, no prelude that would allow the world to brace itself. The shift from normalcy to nightmare was instantaneous. Inside the home, Austin Thompson made the final transition from a silent, brooding adolescent to an active shooter. He abandoned the mask he had worn for years, armed himself with a shotgun, a pistol, and a hunting knife, and turned first toward the person closest to him. The normalcy of Hedingham was about to be shattered, not by a stranger, but by one of its own sons, proving that the most impenetrable disguises are often the most ordinary ones. The shift from a typical Thursday afternoon to a historic tragedy did not begin with the pull of a trigger, but rather with the crystallization of a philosophy that had been festering in the dark corners of a 15-year-old mind. The silence of the Thompson home was not peaceful. It was a container for a distinct and heavy calculation. For Austin Thompson, the violence to come was not an impulsive reaction to a bad grade, a breakup, or a domestic dispute. It was the terminal output of a worldview that had detached itself from human empathy long before he picked up a weapon. Investigators and forensic psychologists who later scrutinized the digital and physical debris of Austin's life found the architecture of the massacre in his private writings. A handwritten note, later entered into evidence, provided the Rosetta Stone for understanding why a teenager from a stable, upper-middle-class family would turn his neighborhood into a hunting ground. The motive was not personal grievance but a sweeping, nihilistic misanthropy. He wrote that he hated humans because they were destroying the planet. This was not the chaotic scrawl of a sudden psychotic break, but the cold, articulate conclusion of someone who had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner of his own species. This intellectualization of murder was what Judge Paul Ridgway would later point to as the hallmark of irreparable corruption, a legal threshold distinguishing a salvageable child from a permanent danger to society. The preparation required to execute his vision was marked by a chilling practicality. There was no desperate scramble for black market weapons or complex illicit transactions. The tools of destruction were domestic, familiar, and accessible. In the Hedingham community, specifically within the Thompson household, firearms were present, a not uncommon feature of life in North Carolina. Austin did not need to bypass sophisticated security systems or break into safes that were beyond his knowledge. He simply accessed the inventory available to him, betraying the implicit trust that exists between parent and child. He selected a shotgun and a pistol, weapons he likely knew how to handle, suggesting a familiarity gained through authorized supervision that he now perverted for unauthorized use. The planning extended beyond weaponry to the aesthetics of the act. Witnesses and surveillance footage would later confirm that Austin dressed for the occasion. He donned camouflage clothing, a choice that served a dual purpose. Tactically, it allowed him to blend into the wooded areas of the Neuse River Greenway, where he intended to stalk his victims. Psychologically, it signaled a transition from civilian to combatant. By putting on the uniform of a soldier, he was visually separating himself from the community he was about to attack, creating a barrier between his identity as a neighbor and his new identity as a predator. This ritual of dressing was a deliberate step in the sequence, a moment where he shed the social contract and assumed the role of the aggressor. In the hours leading up to 5 p.m., the house remained quiet. The parents were not present to witness the transformation, leaving the two brothers alone in the space that had raised them. This specific window of time was crucial. Austin waited for the optimal conditions: low interference and high vulnerability. His older brother, 16-year-old James Thompson, was also home. James was a high school junior, described by peers as gentle and unassuming, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the next room. The relationship between the brothers had shown no public fissures that would predict fratricide. There were no police reports of fighting, no school counselor notes indicating violent rivalry. To the outside world, they were simply siblings, coexisting under the same roof. However, in Austin's tactical assessment, James represented the first hurdle. The logic of the plan dictated that the threat inside the perimeter had to be neutralized before the rampage could move outward. The decision to kill James first was not necessarily born of specific hatred for him as an individual, but rather a cold strategic necessity derived from his misanthropic manifesto. If he was to wage war on humanity, the first human in his path had to fall. This decision demonstrated a suppression of familial bond that prosecutors would later argue was incompatible with the impulsive, underdeveloped brain of a typical adolescent offender. It required a steeling of the nerves that defied the natural instinct to protect one's kin. Austin moved through the house with the weapons, gathering the ammunition he would need for a prolonged engagement. He packed a backpack, treating the massacre as an expedition that required supplies. Every magazine loaded, every buckle fastened on his gear, was a reaffirmation of his intent. There was ample time to stop. At any point during the gathering of the shells, the changing of clothes, or the loading of the shotgun, he could have aborted the mission. The sheer number of steps involved in the preparation, the motor skills required, the time elapsed meant that he had dozens of opportunities to reconsider. He took none of them. He moved past the point of no return, not in a sprint, but in a steady, methodical march. The environment around him offered no resistance. The Hedingham neighborhood outside continued its Thursday rhythm. Golfers were on the nearby course. Residents were walking dogs along the greenway. An off-duty police officer was preparing to leave for work. The normalcy of the surroundings acted as a camouflage for Austin's intent just as effectively as the clothing he wore. No one looks at a quiet suburban house and imagines a teenager inside methodically preparing to execute his brother. The horror of the preparation lay in its invisibility. It was a silent accumulation of potential energy, building up behind closed doors, completely undetectable until the moment of release. Inside the home, The final moments before the violence were likely defined by a terrifying intimacy. Austin knew James's location in the house. He knew his brother's habits. He used this domestic intelligence to stage the opening act of the tragedy. He approached James not with a shout or a warning, but with the element of surprise. The weapon was ready. The safety was off. The note had been written. The justification solidified in ink and neuron. The irreparable corruption that the court would later identify was fully formed, sitting heavily in the air of the hallway. Austin Thompson stood on the precipice of his own design. He had successfully dismantled his own humanity piece by piece, replacing empathy with a rigid, destructive logic. He viewed the people outside, and the brother inside, not as living beings with futures, but as symptoms of a planetary disease he had resolved to cure through excision. The preparation was complete. The silent phase was over. The boy who had existed in the eyes of his parents and teachers was gone, replaced by the entity that would haunt Raleigh forever. He raised the weapon, looking at the person who had shared his childhood, and prepared to initiate the sequence that would end it. V-logic that viewed familial bonds not as sacred tethers, but as biological coincidences to be severed. The hallway of the Thompson residence in Hedingham, typically a transitional space of domestic routine, became the staging ground for an atrocity that would defy the natural order of sibling protection. James Thompson, 16 years old and a junior at Knightdale High School, stood unaware of the weapon leveled at him. There was no argument. There was no shouted manifesto or demand for submission. The interaction was stripped of all communication, reduced entirely to the mechanics of execution. Austin Thompson, only 15, held a shotgun. The physicality of the weapon required intent. It was not a device that could be discharged with a casual flick of a finger like a handgun. It required leverage, stance, and a deliberate engagement with the recoil that was to come. At this range, inside the confines of a suburban home, the acoustic violence of a shotgun blast is overwhelming. When Austin pulled the trigger, the sound shattered the afternoon quiet of the cul-de-sac, though the exterior walls dampened the noise enough that the neighbors did not immediately understand the war zone that had erupted next door. The shot struck James with catastrophic force. In forensic terms, a shotgun discharge at close range acts less like a projectile and more like a demolition tool. The spread of the shot had not yet occurred, meaning the full kinetic energy of the shell was delivered to a focused point on James's body. The impact would have been instantly incapacitating, knocking the 16-year-old backward and collapsing his physical frame against the hallway architecture. The suddenness of the violence left no room for defensive wounds or a struggle. James did not fight for his life because he was not given the nanosecond of cognitive processing required to realize his life was at risk. He was erased from the standing world by his own brother before he could register the betrayal. However, the violence did not end with the ballistic trauma. The subsequent actions taken by Austin Thompson provided the court and the psychological evaluators with the darkest evidence of the irreparable corruption cited in his sentencing. Having discharged the firearm and neutralized the immediate presence of his brother, Austin did not recoil in horror. He did not drop the weapon as the reality of the bloodshed manifested on the floor before him. A panicked child, acting on a sudden impulse or an accidental discharge, would typically rush to the victim, scream for help, or freeze in a state of catatonic shock. Austin did none of these things. Instead, he transitioned to a secondary weapon. He was armed with a hunting knife, a tool designed for dressing game, characterized by a fixed blade and a durable handle. Approaching the fallen body of his brother, Austin engaged in a manual assault that followed the shooting. He stabbed James multiple times. This escalation from a distance weapon to a contact weapon marked a critical psychological threshold. Shooting requires aim and a trigger pull. Stabbing requires physical exertion, proximity, and the tactile sensation of the blade entering tissue. It is an intimate form of violence. To inflict stab wounds upon a sibling who has already been shot demonstrates a level of detachment and committed rage that moves beyond a mere desire to kill and into the realm of obliteration. The medical examiner's findings would later document the dual nature of the trauma, painting a picture of a relentless attack. The stab wounds ensured that any chance of survival, however slim, was extinguished. This was not a chaotic frenzy, but a methodical completion of a task. The handwritten note found later, declaring a hatred for humanity, found its first practical application here. Austin had successfully categorized his brother not as James, the person he had shared a childhood with, but as a component of the humans he despised. By stripping James of his identity and reducing him to a representative of the species, Austin was able to bypass the innate biological inhibition against killing kin. The atmosphere inside the house shifted from the quiet of a Thursday afternoon to the sterile stillness of a crime scene. With James lying dead or dying in the hallway, the house was no longer a home. It was a container for a fratricide. Austin stood amidst the carnage he had manufactured. He was dressed for the operational phase of his plan, wearing camouflage clothing that signaled his perception of the event, not as a tragedy, but as a tactical mission. A backpack containing a large quantity of ammunition was with him. The logistical preparation was evident. He had accounted for the need to reload, the need to carry supplies, and the need to blend into the wooded environments of the neighborhood. He did not call 911. He did not attempt to staunch the flow of blood from his brother's wounds. The time that passed between the killing of James and Austin's exit from the home was likely brief, governed only by the necessity of gathering his gear. The emotional weight of the act appeared to have no gravitational pull on him. He moved through the residence with the efficiency of a soldier clearing a room, stepping past the reality of the murder he had just committed. The disconnect was absolute. In the eyes of the law and the forensic psychologists who would later analyze the timeline, this moment was the point of no return. Once the brother was dead, the social contract was entirely incinerated. If he could kill James, the brother who slept down the hall, then the neighbors, the dog walkers, and the police officers outside were merely targets of opportunity. Austin moved to the exit. The sensory details of the scene he left behind were horrific. The smell of propellant, the metallic scent of blood, the visual distortion of the violence in a domestic setting, but he carried none of that trauma out with him. He carried only the weapons and the ammunition. As he stepped out of the house, he left the door to his previous life open, both literally and metaphorically. The transition from the private sphere of the home to the public sphere of the Hedingham neighborhood was seamless. He did not run out in a panic. He emerged as an active shooter beginning his patrol. The killing of James Thompson served as the internal detonator for the massacre. It was the act that burned the bridge back to normalcy. By starting with the most difficult target, the one with the highest emotional barrier, Austin effectively inoculated himself against hesitation for the killings that would follow. The irreparable corruption Judge Ridgway would speak of was not just in the planning or the philosophy of the note, but in this specific sequence, the decision to make his brother the first casualty of his war against the world. As Austin stepped onto the porch and then into the yard, the silence of the neighborhood resumed, masking the horror inside the house. The timeline indicates that James's body would remain undiscovered for a short while, a silent testament to the betrayal, while Austin began his movement toward the News River Greenway. The fratricide was complete. The biological link was severed. The 15-year-old gunman turned his attention away from the ruin of his family and toward the unaware community that surrounded him, his capacity for violence now fully unlocked and verified by the blood on his hands. The rampage had officially begun, initiated by the singular, irreversible act of executing his own brother. It was just after 5 p.m. on a Thursday. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of the Hedingham subdivision. This was a neighborhood defined by its quietude, a golf course community where the rhythm of life was dictated by tea times and evening walks. Austin Thompson, now armed with a shotgun, a handgun, and a backpack laden with ammunition, stepped out of the home where his brother lay dead and into the open air of Sahalee Way. The transition from the intimate violence of the indoors to the public theater of the street was seamless. There was no pause for reflection, no moment of panicked regret. He simply began to hunt. The geography of Hedingham played a crucial role in the mechanics of the massacre. The streets wind tightly, lined with two-story homes, offering limited sightlines but ample targets for someone willing to fire at whatever moved. Austin did not have to travel far to find his next victims. The rampage that followed was not a frantic spray of bullets born of panic, but a systematic execution of the misanthropic philosophy later found scrawled in his notes. He had declared war on humanity, and the specific identities of the humans he encountered mattered little to him. They were merely representatives of the species he claimed to despise. Marcelle Lynn Gardner was among the first to cross his path. She was in the vicinity of the neighborhood streets, engaging in the mundane, peaceful activities that characterize suburban life. The roar of the shotgun shattered the ambient sounds of the afternoon. Gardner was struck, the blast knocking her to the ground with critical injuries. She would survive, but the violence inflicted upon her signaled to the neighborhood that the danger was lethal and indiscriminate. The shooter did not stop to check her condition. He moved on, his gait steady, his focus entirely on the acquisition of the next target. Further along the street, Nicole Connors, a 52-year-old matriarch of the neighborhood known for her kindness and community spirit, was outside. She was with her dog, a small terrier named Sammy. The presence of the animal offered no pause to the shooter's trigger finger. In the twisted logic of his manifesto, the destruction of the planet was a sin of humanity, yet his actions displayed a total disregard for life in any form. He fired upon Connors and her dog. Both were killed. The scene on the pavement was one of absolute devastation, a neighbor and her loyal companion gunned down in front of the homes they lived in. The noise of these shots began to draw attention, heads turning in confusion, windows opening, but the speed of the violence outpaced the comprehension of the witnesses. At this juncture, the rampage intersected with a tragic coincidence involving law enforcement. Officer Gabriel Torres of the Raleigh Police Department was not in uniform, nor was he in a marked cruiser. He was in his personal vehicle, preparing to leave for work. He was 29 years old, a husband and father, simply a man sitting in his car in his own neighborhood. To Austin Thompson, Torres was just another silhouette behind a windshield. As Thompson approached Osprey Cove Drive, he raised his weapon and fired into the vehicle. Torres was struck before he could ever identify the threat or shift into the role of a police officer. He died in the driver's seat, his vehicle rolling forward before coming to a stop. The killing of an off-duty officer added a layer of chaos to the unfolding emergency response, but in that moment for the shooter, it was simply another tally in his war. Having turned the streets of his own neighborhood into a killing field, Thompson altered his trajectory. The Hedingham community backs up to the Neuse River Greenway, a scenic paved trail system that runs for miles through the woods and along the river. It is a sanctuary for runners, cyclists, and dog walkers, a place designed for escape and recreation. Thompson moved away from the asphalt of the streets and toward the tree line, carrying his arsenal into the greenway. This tactical shift demonstrated a predatory awareness. The streets were becoming loud with sirens and shouting, but the trail offered both cover and a steady stream of unsuspecting victims who had no idea what was occurring just a few hundred yards away. The atmosphere on the greenway was tranquil. The canopy of trees muffled the sounds of the sirens wailing in the distance, likely interpreted by those on the trail as a traffic accident on a nearby highway. Mary Marshall, 34 years old, was walking her dog. She was days away from her 35th birthday and was in the midst of planning her wedding. She was walking on the trail, likely enjoying the cooling air of the late afternoon. When Thompson encountered her, the dynamic was terrifyingly one-sided. He was camouflaged and armed. She was defenseless. The encounter was brief. Thompson fired, killing Marshall. The calculated nature of the act was evident in the lack of interaction. There was no demand, no robbery, no exchange of words. Just the mechanical action of raising the gun and firing. Further along the trail, Susan Carnatz, 49, was on a run. A dedicated mother and an avid runner, she was moving with the rhythm of her exercise, her focus likely on her breathing and her pace. The intrusion of the shooter into her path was abrupt. Thompson engaged her with the same lethal efficiency he had shown the others. Carnatz was struck and killed on the pavement of the trail, her run ended by a force of violence she could not have predicted. The trail, usually a symbol of community health and connection, was transformed into a linear trap. The dense foliage on either side meant there were few avenues for escape once the shooting started. As the bodies lay on the trail and the streets, the timeline of the shooting suggests a terrifying density of violence. The attacks occurred in rapid succession, spanning a window of roughly 30 minutes. In that half hour, Thompson had dismantled families, killed a police officer, and shattered the sense of safety for an entire region. The physical toll was catastrophic: 5 dead, including his brother, and 2 injured. But the psychological toll was expanding in real time. Calls to 911 began to flood the dispatch center, painting a fractured picture of a boy in camo moving through yards and woods. The descriptions were consistent: a white male, juvenile appearance, long gun, calm demeanor. The rampage was characterized not just by who was killed, but by the manner in which Thompson moved. Witnesses and later forensic reconstruction suggests he did not run frantically. He did not scream or shout. He moved with a chilling purposefulness, described by prosecutors later as the behavior of someone hunting game rather than a child acting out of impulse. This demeanor would later be central to Judge Ridgway's assessment of irreparable corruption. A child acting in a sudden fit of rage might fire wildly or hesitate when confronted with the reality of blood. Thompson did neither. He reloaded. He aimed. He selected targets of varying ages and genders, confirming the totalizing nature of his hatred. As the sun dipped lower, the initial burst of gunfire ceased. The sirens were now deafeningly close, blue lights fracturing the twilight as Raleigh police, Wake County deputies, and emergency medical teams descended on Hedingham. They found a scene of confusion and horror. Residents were emerging from their homes to perform CPR on neighbors. Officer Torres's vehicle was surrounded. The bodies on the greenway were discovered by other walkers, leading to panicked retreats and desperate calls for help. The shooter, however, had vanished from the immediate vicinity. Thompson had utilized the connectivity of the trail system not just as a hunting ground, but as a route of egress. He moved deeper into the woods, away from the suburban streets, and toward an area littered with outbuildings and dense brush. The active shooting phase of the event had concluded, but the threat remained active. He had not surrendered, nor had he taken his own life at the scene of the crimes. Instead, he had taken his weapons and his ammunition and entrenched himself, transitioning from an active shooter into a barricaded subject. The devastation left in his wake was absolute. In less than an hour, the Hedingham neighborhood had been permanently branded by the tragedy. The logic of the violence was circular and self-contained. The note found later would explain the hatred, but the actions on the ground spoke of a detachment that defied simple categorization. He had walked past houses he likely knew, killed people who may have waved to him in passing days prior, and desecrated the natural spaces he grew up near. The silence that fell over the trail after the shots stopped was heavier than before. It was the silence of a crime scene, soon to be broken by the shouts of tactical teams sweeping the woods. Austin Thompson was no longer just a 15-year-old boy. He was a phantom in the tree line, a mass murderer who had successfully executed a plan of devastation. The promptness of the violence, the steady hand with which it was delivered, and the geographic spread of the victims from the home to the street to the trail created a complex crime scene that stretched for over a mile. As night fully descended, the manhunt began. The rampage was over, but the standoff was just beginning. The community of Raleigh locked their doors, sheltered in place, and waited for news. While in the darkness of the woods, Austin Thompson sat with his weapons, waiting for the inevitable confrontation with the world he had tried to destroy. The irreparable corruption was now fully manifest, written in blood across the asphalt and the earth of Hedingham, leaving a scar that no sentence, not even life without parole, could ever fully heal. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that Thursday evening, the Hedingham neighborhood transformed from a suburban crime scene into a tactical theater of operations. The darkness of the unlit stretches along the Neuse River Greenway provided cover for the gunmen, but it also necessitated a shift in law enforcement strategy. The initial chaotic response characterized by officers rushing to the aid of gunshot victims on the streets and trails, evolved into a methodical, grid-based manhunt. The objective had shifted from triage to neutralization. Hundreds of officers from multiple agencies, including the Raleigh Police Department, the Wake County Sheriff's Office, and the North Carolina State Highway Patrol, converged on the perimeter. The scale of the mobilization was unprecedented for the area, with blue lights saturating the residential streets while the wooded areas remained ominously dark. Command centers were established, and the airspace above the Neuse River filled with the drone of police helicopters equipped with forward-looking infrared cameras. These thermal imaging systems were critical. In the dense foliage of the North Carolina autumn, visual identification was nearly impossible without the aid of heat signatures. For hours, the suspect remained a ghost. The radius of the search expanded outward from the trail where the bodies of Mary Marshall and Susan Carnotz had been discovered. Canine units were deployed, their handlers moving cautiously through the underbrush, aware that the target was armed with a shotgun and a handgun, and had already demonstrated a willingness to engage anyone in his path. The tension among the search teams was palpable. They were hunting a 15-year-old boy, but the lethality of his actions had stripped away the hesitation usually afforded to a minor. The profile developed in those early hours suggested a shooter who was not fleeing in panic, but moving with intent. Around 6:45 p.m., nearly 2 hours after the first shots were fired, the investigation began to narrow. Intelligence gathered from the initial scenes, combined with witness reports and tracking dogs, led tactical teams toward an area near McConnell-Oliver Drive, roughly a mile from the epicenter of the violence. The location was a mix of rural and residential, characterized by larger plots of land and outbuildings that offered ample concealment. Attention focused on a specific structure, a barn-like shed situated in a wooded area, detached from the main residences. It was a structure that provided not just a hiding place, but a fortified position. Officers established a hard perimeter around the outbuilding. The approach was slow and calculated. The use of armored vehicles, specifically the Lenco Bearcat, allowed tactical teams to close the distance without exposing themselves to direct fire. The vehicle, designed to withstand high-caliber rounds, became the shield for the entry team. As the Bearcat crunched over the gravel and dry leaves toward the shed, the silence of the standoff was shattered. Austin Thompson was waiting. As the tactical team maneuvered into position, gunfire erupted from the darkness of the shed. The suspect fired multiple rounds at the approaching law enforcement officers. The bullets struck the armored exterior of the police vehicle and the surrounding ground, confirming two critical pieces of information. The suspect was indeed inside, and he had no intention of surrendering peacefully. The officers returned fire, illuminating the woods with the muzzle flashes of their service weapons. The exchange was brief but violent, a kinetic release of the tension that had built over the preceding hours. Following the volley of gunfire, silence returned to the shed. The tactical teams did not immediately rush the structure. The doctrine for such standoffs dictates caution. A wounded subject can still be lethal, and silence can be a trap. The police maintained their containment, illuminating the structure with high-intensity spotlights that cut through the gloom, turning the wooden siding stark white against the black backdrop of the forest. Commands were shouted via loudspeakers, ordering the occupant to come out with hands raised, to surrender the weapon, to end the violence. There was no response. For a significant period, the standoff entered a holding pattern. Hostage negotiators were on site, ready to communicate, but the lack of response from the shed made dialogue impossible. The tactical commanders had to weigh the risk of entering a confined space against the possibility that the suspect was bleeding out or preparing for a final ambush. Drones were utilized to fly closer to the structure, attempting to peer through gaps in the wood or open windows to gain visual intelligence on the interior. Approaching 8 p.m., the decision was made to breach the perimeter of the shed. The tactical teams, utilizing ballistic shields and heavy armor, advanced. The final approach was executed with extreme precision. Upon entering the structure, officers found Austin Thompson on the ground. He was not in a posture of surrender. He was suffering from a severe gunshot wound. Next to him lay the shotgun and the handgun, the tools of the massacre that had claimed 5 lives. Also present was a backpack, later found to contain boxes of ammunition and a hunting knife, indicating that he had prepared for a prolonged engagement or further violence. The nature of Thompson's injury was critical and immediate. He had sustained a gunshot wound that would later be determined as self-inflicted, a final act of violence turned inward when the escape routes were cut off and the walls closed in. Despite the carnage he had wrought, the priority of the officers shifted instantly from neutralization to preservation. Tactical medics moved in, applying trauma care to the 15-year-old. The scene was secured, the weapons were swept away, and the suspect was handcuffed, though his physical condition rendered him incapacitated. Radio traffic at 9:34 p.m. confirmed the suspect was in custody. The message rippled through the command post and out to the anxious community. The threat was neutralized. Thompson was loaded into an ambulance, flanked by police cruisers, and rushed to WakeMed Hospital in critical condition. The drive to the trauma center was a race against time, as the gravity of his wounds threatened to end the judicial process before it could begin. He survived the transport and the subsequent emergency surgeries, remaining hospitalized for weeks under heavy guard. The conclusion of the standoff at the shed marked the end of the active violence, but it opened the door to the forensic and legal excavation of the event. Inside the shed, and on Thompson's person, investigators found the physical manifestations of his mindset. The handwritten note, crumpled but legible, offered the only immediate insight into the why that the community desperately sought. His capture at the shed also solidified the timeline of the atrocity. A single continuous act of destruction that began in a hallway with his brother and ended in a standoff surrounded by heavily armed police. The shed itself became a focal point of the crime scene processing. Technicians meticulously documented the trajectory of the bullets, the position of the shooter, and the layout of the weapons. It stood as a testament to the final phase of the rampage, a place where a teenager, having executed a plan of irreparable corruption, faced the inevitable conclusion of his actions. The standoff proved that this was not a momentary lapse of judgment or a sudden psychotic break that dissipated after the adrenaline faded. It was a sustained, committed effort to kill and to fight until the very end. The boy who was pulled from the floor of that outbuilding was no longer viewed by the state as a child, but as a defendant who had waged a war against his own community. The silence of the woods returned, but the echoes of the gunfire at the shed would reverberate through the legal proceedings for years to come. The silence that descended upon the Hedingham neighborhood after the final gunshot was deceptive. While the physical threat had been neutralized in the standoff at the shed, a deeper, more complex investigation was just beginning. The crime scene tape demarcated the geography of the violence, but investigators needed to map the geography of Austin Thompson's mind. For days, the community and the nation asked a singular, haunting question: why? The answer did not lie in the ballistics reports or the autopsy summaries, but in the quiet corners of a teenage boy's private life, buried within digital footprints and handwritten confessions that transformed a tragedy into a study of absolute nihilism. Detectives moved from the bloody reality of the streets to the sterile environment of the forensics lab, where the contents of Thompson's pockets and bedroom were cataloged. The breakthrough regarding the motive came in the form of a handwritten note, a piece of physical evidence that stripped away any hope of finding a conventional trigger. There was no history of school bullying that could explain the carnage, no sudden romantic rejection, and no radicalization by a known terror group. Instead, the text revealed a chillingly developed misanthropy. The scrawled words, entered into evidence during the sentencing phase, declared a hatred for humanity based on the perception that people were destroying the planet. It was a cold, eco-misanthropic rationale that framed mass murder not as an act of anger, but as a distorted act of correction. This manifesto provided the framework through which prosecutors viewed the killing of James Thompson. The initial assault on his 16-year-old brother was not merely a preamble or an obstacle to be removed. It was the first committed step of the plan. Forensic reconstruction of the bathroom where James was attacked showed a level of violence that defied the typical profile of sibling conflict. Austin had not only shot his brother but also stabbed him, a dual method of assault that suggested a distinct intent to ensure mortality. This intimacy of violence against a family member dismantled the defense that the shooting was a result of a dissociative break. The killer looked into the eyes of someone he had lived with his entire life and executed him before turning his weapon on the neighborhood. The brother was not collateral damage. He was the primary test subject of Austin's resolve. As digital forensic specialists unlocked Thompson's electronic devices, the timeline of the crime expanded backward from the 13th of October 2022. The data revealed that the rampage was not an impulsive snap of a developing adolescent brain, but a meticulously choreographed event. Search histories and cached files painted a picture of a 15-year-old who had been rehearsing the logistics of death long before he pulled the trigger. He had studied the mechanics of the weapons available to him and calculated the most effective way to inflict maximum casualties. This evidence of premeditation was critical. In juvenile justice, the distinction between an impulsive act of passion and a calculated plot often determines the difference between a pathway to rehabilitation and a life behind bars. The digital trail proved that Thompson had ample time to reconsider, to stop, or to seek help. Instead, he refined his plan. The investigation into his background deepened the mystery for those who knew him. Interviews with teachers, neighbors, and peers yielded descriptions of a quiet, unremarkable student. There were no prior criminal records or flashing warning signs typically associated with such catastrophic violence. This outward normalcy made the revelation of his inner monologue even more disturbing. He had successfully compartmentalized his life, maintaining a facade of suburban conformity while nurturing a corrupted worldview. The duality was absolute. To his parents, he was a child. To the digital void and his private journal, he was an arbiter of life and death. The contrast suggested that the motive was not born of external trauma, but of an internal, festering ideology that he protected until the moment of execution. During the extensive legal proceedings that culminated in February 2026, the prosecution utilized this dichotomy to argue for the maximum penalty. Under North Carolina law and federal precedents regarding juvenile offenders, sentencing a minor to life without the possibility of parole is a rare exception, reserved only for those deemed permanently incorrigible. To meet this high bar, the state had to prove that the crime reflected irreparable corruption rather than transient immaturity. The motive became the linchpin of this argument. Prosecutors contended that a teenager who creates a philosophical justification for mass murder, targets his own brother to initiate the spree, and prepares with such tactical precision, demonstrates a character trait that cannot be fixed by therapy or time. Superior Court Judge Paul Ridgway's evaluation of the motive was clinical and exhaustive. The court looked at the how to understand the why. The choice of clothing, the route taken through the Hedingham streets, and the selection of targets, including an off-duty police officer, indicated a predator's mindset. The defense argued that the adolescent brain is not fully formed, that the capacity for empathy and impulse control is still under construction at age 15. They posited that the misanthropic note was the ramblings of a confused child, not the manifesto of a monster. However, the sheer irreversibility of his actions weighed heavily against this narrative. The judge noted that the defendant did not just lash out, he hunted. The psychological evaluations presented during the sentencing hearing further unmasked the depth of Thompson's detachment. Experts analyzed the note regarding the planet and humanity, cross-referencing it with his behavior during the standoff and subsequent custody. There was a noted absence of panic or regret in the immediate aftermath. The motive was not a sudden burst of rage that burned out, leaving a frightened child in its wake. It was a sustained conviction. The killing of 5 people and the injuring of 2 others was the practical application of his belief system. The court found that this level of ideological commitment to violence, devoid of personal animus toward the specific victims, signaled a dangerousness that defied standard rehabilitation models. The concept of irreparable corruption is a legal term of art, but in the courtroom, it took on a tangible weight. It meant that the 15-year-old who walked out of his house that October day had fundamentally broken the social contract in a way that could not be mended. The judge's ruling in 2026 highlighted that the planning involved in the crime demonstrated a maturity of intent that belied the defendant's chronological age. Thompson had not stumbled into mass murder, he had authored it. The manifesto about hating humans was not interpreted as a cry for help, but as a final judgment delivered by the shooter upon his community. Furthermore, the specific targeting of the Hedingham neighborhood, a place of safety and familiarity, weaponized the very concept of home. By turning his own safe haven into a kill zone, Thompson demonstrated a total rejection of the community bonds that usually restrain violent impulses. The motive was not just to kill, but to dismantle the sense of security for everyone around him. The betrayal of the brother was the microcosm. The betrayal of the neighborhood was the macrocosm. Both stemmed from the same root of detachment detailed in his writings. When Judge Ridgway handed down the sentence of life without the possibility of parole, it was a judicial confirmation that the motive was understood and rejected as irredeemable. The court effectively ruled that the why was so abhorrent and the how so calculated that society could never risk the defendant's release. The finding of irreparable corruption was the legal seal on the investigation. It affirmed that the boy who emerged from the tree line that day was not a victim of circumstance or biology, but the architect of his own atrocity. The unmasking was complete. The quiet teenager was gone, replaced in the public record by the cold rationality of his own manifesto, leaving a legacy defined not by who he was, but by the terrible clarity of why he acted. The motive, once hidden in a notebook, now stood as the permanent justification for his permanent incarceration. The courtroom in Wake County Superior Court fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as the calendar turned to September 2025. Nearly 3 years had passed since the Hedingham neighborhood had been transformed from a quiet suburb into a crime scene of sprawling devastation, and the legal proceedings against Austin Thompson were finally reaching their zenith. The defendant, now 18 years old, sat at the defense table, a figure physically matured from the 15-year-old boy who had been hospitalized in critical condition following the standoff, yet the charges against him remained anchored in the actions of a child. The state had elected to try him as an adult, a procedural necessity given the scale of the carnage. 5 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and assault with a deadly weapon. There would be no jury trial to determine guilt or innocence. In a move that surprised few legal observers but sent ripples of relief through the families of the victims who wished to avoid reliving the graphic details of the massacre in a protracted trial, Thompson entered a plea of guilty to all charges. He stood before the bench, answering the standard judicial inquiries with monosyllabic responses, affirming his understanding that by pleading guilty, he was waiving his right to appeal the facts of the case. The admission was total. He accepted legal responsibility for the deaths of Gabriel Torres, Mary Marshall, Susan Carnatz, Nicole Connors, and his own older brother, James Thompson. However, under North Carolina law and the federal precedents set by the Supreme Court in Miller v. Section, Alabama, a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole for a juvenile offender was unconstitutional unless the state could prove the defendant was permanently incorrigible. The guilty plea was not the end. It was the precursor to the true battle, the sentencing hearing. The hearing to determine Thompson's fate began in early February 2026. This was the Miller hearing, a specific legal proceeding required to decide if the defendant was merely a product of unfortunate yet transient immaturity, or if he exhibited irreparable corruption. The distinction was the difference between a future with a glimmer of hope for release after 25 years, or a guarantee that he would die within the confines of a correctional facility. The burden of proof rested heavily on the prosecution to demonstrate that Thompson was beyond redemption. District Attorney Lauren Freeman's team opened their presentation not with the chaotic aftermath of the shooting, but with the chilling orderliness that preceded it. They projected images of the digital and physical evidence recovered from Thompson's bedroom and electronic devices. The courtroom was forced to confront the reality that this was not a snap decision made in a moment of adolescent passion. Prosecutors displayed the handwritten note found in Thompson's possession, a document that stripped away any defense of confusion or panic. The scrawled manifesto declared a hatred for humanity and a desire to save the planet by eliminating humans. It was misanthropy distilled into a violent action plan. The prosecution argued that the ideological rigidity of the note demonstrated a hardened heart, a level of calculation that defied the typical impulsivity associated with the teenage brain. The most damaging evidence against the concept of rehabilitation was the death of James Thompson. Prosecutors meticulously reconstructed the timeline, showing that Austin had not started his rampage with strangers. He had begun in the intimacy of his own home. He had stabbed and shot his 16-year-old brother, a person with whom he had shared a life, a room, and a childhood. This act, the state argued, was the threshold event. It required a suppression of empathy so profound that it signaled a fundamental break from human norms. To kill a stranger is a horror. To kill a brother is a primal violation that suggests a depth of depravity the state argued was unfixable. The prosecutor pointed out that Austin did not stop after this emotional singularity. He didn't collapse in regret. Instead, he gathered his weapons, donned his tactical gear, and walked out the door to hunt his neighbors. The defense team faced the monumental task of contextualizing the monstrous. They called upon forensic psychologists and experts in adolescent development to testify about the malleability of the teenage brain. They argued that at 15, the frontal cortex, the area responsible for impulse control, empathy, and long-term planning, is still under construction. The defense posited that the planning the state described was actually a fantasy gone wrong, a delusion fueled by isolation, and an immature understanding of consequence. They presented testimony regarding Thompson's home life and his social withdrawal, attempting to paint a picture of a boy who had spiraled silently, whose actions were a symptom of untreated mental health crises rather than innate evil. They pleaded with Judge Paul Ridgway to look beyond the tragedy of the act and see the potential for change in the actor. A life sentence, they argued, was a judgment that a 15-year-old was a finished product, incapable of growth or remorse. Throughout the days of testimony, the gallery remained a landscape of grief. The victim impact statements brought the abstract legal arguments back to the visceral reality of loss. Family members of Nicole Connors spoke of her kindness and her role as a matriarch in the neighborhood. The widow of Officer Gabriel Torres, who was killed while heading to work, spoke of the uniform he never got to fully wear that day and the void left in their family. The most complex grief belonged to the Thompson family parents, who sat in the impossible position of mourning one son while watching the other face the prospect of a legal death. Their silence in the courtroom was a testament to a pain that had no vocabulary. The hearing concluded, and the courtroom awaited the decision of Judge Ridgway. In North Carolina, sentencing in such complex juvenile cases is not instantaneous. The judge took time to review the binders of evidence, the psychological reports, and the case law surrounding the irreparable corruption standard. When the court reconvened in mid-February 2026, the atmosphere was brittle with tension. Security was tight, and the press gallery was packed. Judge Ridgway took the bench, his demeanor grave. He did not simply announce a number. He was required to articulate the findings that justified the sentence. Judge Ridgway began by acknowledging the science of adolescent development. He conceded that, generally, children are different from adults, more reckless, more susceptible to peer pressure, and more capable of change. He cited the Supreme Court's warnings that life without parole should be an uncommon sentence for juvenile offenders. However, he then pivoted to the specific facts of State v. Thompson. He noted that while impulsivity is a hallmark of youth, the evidence in this case showed a sustained commitment to violence. The planning was not a momentary lapse. It was a project. The judge focused intently on the hedonic nature of the violence described in the prosecution's case and the misanthropic manifesto. He noted that the defendant's writings did not reflect a specific grievance against an individual or a reaction to abuse, but rather a generalized, philosophical decision to destroy life. This, the judge reasoned, indicated a personality structure that was deeply entrenched in antisocial logic. But it was the fratricide that anchored the judge's final determination. Judge Ridgway spoke to the killing of James Thompson as the defining moment that separated this case from other instances of juvenile homicide. He described the act as requiring a steely resolve that was incompatible with the concept of a transiently immature mind. The judge reasoned that to kill one's brother, and then immediately transition to the tactical execution of neighbors, demonstrated a compartmentalization and a lack of empathy that was not merely undeveloped but absent. The brutality was not a loss of control, it was the exercise of control. He addressed the argument of rehabilitation. For a sentence of life with the possibility of parole, the court must believe that the defendant possesses the capacity to rejoin society. Judge Ridgway stated that the risk to the public remained absolute. He found that the irreparable corruption standard had been met not because the defendant was a monster in a fairy tale sense, but because his actions demonstrated a permanent detachment from the moral contract that binds society together. The judge looked directly at the defendant, who stood flanked by his attorneys. "The court finds," Judge Ridgway intoned, his voice carrying to the back of the silent room, "that the defendant's actions reflect a permanent state of incorrigibility. The meticulous nature of the preparation, the specific targeting of a sibling, and the indiscriminate slaughter that followed are evidence of a corruption that cannot be repaired by the passage of time or the interventions of the state." The sentence was pronounced: 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The consecutive nature was symbolic, ensuring that even if laws changed regarding one count, the others would stand as a fortress, keeping him incarcerated. The without parole was the finality. Austin Thompson would die in prison. The reaction in the courtroom was a release of breath held for years. There were no cheers, only the quiet sobbing of relief from the families who now knew they would never have to attend a parole hearing. They would never have to see Austin Thompson's name on a docket again. The defense team packed their files slowly, the weight of the precedent settling on their shoulders. As the deputies moved to shackle Austin Thompson for transport to the Central Prison Intake Center, the reality of the verdict solidified. The 15-year-old boy who had walked out of his house with a shotgun was gone. In his place was a prisoner of the state, his timeline severed from the world outside, his story effectively ended by the scratch of a judicial pen. The legal system had asked if he could be saved, and the answer, written in the blood of the Headingham neighborhood, was a definitive no. The gavel came down, echoing like a final gunshot, closing the chapter on the Raleigh mass shooting and sealing the doors of the penitentiary forever. The 15-year-old stood before the bench, a figure of slight stature bearing the weight of a judgment reserved for the most irredeemable monsters in society. In the eyes of the North Carolina justice system, Austin Thompson had ceased to be a child the moment he donned camouflage and stepped out onto the Neuse River Greenway. The sentencing hearing had been an exhaustive legal battleground, fought not over guilt, which was indisputable, but over the capacity of a human soul to change. The defense had leaned heavily on the science of the adolescent brain, arguing that the neural pathways of a teenager are still under construction, that impulse control and empathy are not yet fully formed, and that a life sentence without the possibility of parole was a condemnation of potential rather than a punishment for action. They pleaded for a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, a chance for a man in his 40s or 50s to emerge from prison having shed the violent skin of the boy. Superior Court Judge Paul Ridgway, however, looked past the biological arguments and focused on the chilling specificity of the evidence. To impose a sentence of life without parole on a juvenile, the court must find that the defendant reflects irreparable corruption rather than the transient immaturity of youth. This is a high legal bar, designed to protect minors who make terrible, impulsive mistakes from being discarded by the state. But the prosecution dismantled the notion of impulsivity piece by piece. They argued that Thompson's actions were not a frantic burst of teenage angst, but a cold, calculated campaign of extermination. The timeline presented to the court did not show a boy snapping under pressure. It showed a predator preparing for a hunt. The judge's ruling hinged on the concept of permanence. For corruption to be irreparable, It must be shown that the moral deficit is so deep, so fundamental to the individual's character, that no amount of time, therapy, or maturation could ever fix it. The court found this proof in the initial moments of the rampage. The decision to begin the slaughter with his own brother, James Thompson, was cited as a primary indicator of this severed humanity. The forensic evidence showed that Austin did not merely shoot his brother. He stabbed and shot him, utilizing multiple weapons in a focused effort to ensure death. This act of fratricide, executed against the person who should have been his closest ally, demonstrated a detachment from human connection that defied psychological explanation. Furthermore, the handwritten note discovered by investigators became the manifesto of his incorrigibility. The scrawled words declaring a hatred for humans and a desire to save the planet by eliminating them were interpreted not as the ramblings of a confused child, but as a crystallized worldview. Judge Ridgway noted that the defendant came from a stable home environment devoid of the abuse, neglect, or extreme poverty that often contextualizes juvenile violence. In the absence of external trauma to blame, the court was left with a terrifying conclusion. The darkness came from within. The stability of his background stripped away the usual mitigating factors. If a loving home could not prevent him from meticulously planning the mass murder of his neighbors and family, the prison system certainly could not rehabilitate him. The term irreparable corruption echoed through the courtroom as the final seal on Thompson's fate. It was a judicial declaration that Austin Thompson was finished. The legal analysis determined that his character was not fluid but fixed in concrete. The planning, the execution, the choice of targets, and the sheer efficiency of the violence against 5 dead and 2 injured signaled a personality that had already hardened beyond the reach of redemption. By sentencing him to die in prison, the state of North Carolina acknowledged that there are some acts so heinous they permanently cancel the perpetrator's membership in the human community, regardless of the date on their birth certificate. As the hearing concluded, the abstract legal debate over brain development was silenced by the stark reality of the judge's order. Austin Thompson would not grow up to be someone else. He would simply grow old within the walls of a correctional facility, defined forever by the decisions he made at 15.